So on to chapter 9, the parents. Now we maybe know a little bit more about the parents than at the moment Miss Honey does. I wonder what Miss Honey thinks about them now and what she might think about them by the end of the chapter. I'd be interested to think what you think too. Maybe you could send me an email on it. So, when Miss Honey emerged from the headmistress's study, most of the children were out in the playground. Her first move was to go around the various teachers that taught the senior class and borrow a number of textbooks and books on algebra, geometry, French, English literature and the like. And then she sought out Matilda and called her into the classroom. There is no point, she said, in you sitting in class doing nothing while I'm teaching the rest of the form the 2 times table and how to spell cat and rat and mouse. So during each lesson, I shall be giving you one of these textbooks to study. At the end of the lesson, you can come up to me with any questions that you might have, and I shall try and help you. How does that sound? Thank you, Miss Honey, Matilda said. That sounds fine. I'm sure, Miss Honey said, that we'll be able to get you moved into a much higher form later on, but for the moment, the headmistress wishes you to stay where you are. Very well, Miss Honey, Matilda said. Thank you so much for getting these books for me. What a nice child she is, Miss Honey thought. I don't care what her father said. She seemed very quiet and gentle to me, and not a bit stuck up in spite of her brilliance. In fact, she hardly seems aware of it. So when the class reassembled, came back in after break, Matilda went up to her desk and began to study a textbook on geometry which Miss Honey had given her. The teacher kept half an eye on her at all times and noticed that the child soon became deeply absorbed in the book. Absorbed means she started reading and she couldn't stop. She really was interested in what was on the pages. She never glanced up once during the entire lesson. Miss Honey, meanwhile, was making another decision. She was deciding that she would go herself and have a secret talk with Matilda's mother and father as soon as possible. She simply refused to let the matter rest where it was. The whole thing was ridiculous. She couldn't believe that the parents were totally unaware of their daughter's remarkable talents. After all, Mr. Wormwood was a successful motor car dealer, so she presumed he must be a fairly intelligent man himself. In any event, the parents never underestimated abilities of their children, quite the reverse. Sometimes it is well nigh impossible for a teacher to convince a proud father or mother that actually their beloved offspring was a complete nitwit. Miss Honey felt confident that she would have no difficulty in convincing Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that Matilda was something very special indeed. The trouble was going to be to stop them getting over enthusiastic. What do you think? Do you think she is going to have that trouble? And now Mrs. Honey's hopes began to expand further. She started wondering whether permission might not be sought from the parents for her to give private tuition to Matilda after school. The prospect of coaching a child as bright as this appealed enormously to her professional instinct as a teacher. And suddenly she decided that she would go and call on Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that very evening. She would go fairly late, between 9 and 10, when Matilda was sure to be in bed. What do you think Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood are going to do when she turns up 9 and 10 o'clock at night? And that is precisely what she did. Having got the address from the school records, Miss Honey set out to walk from her own home to the Wormwoods' house shortly after 9. She found the house in a pleasant street where each smallish building was separated from its neighbours by a bit of garden. It was a modern brick house that could not have been cheap to buy, and the name on the gate said Cosy Nook. Nosy Cook might have been better, Miss Honey thought. She was given into playing with words in that way. She liked to choose a word and she liked to try and think what other words she could make out of it. So Cosy Nook had the same kind of words in it that she could make into something else. Okay. She was given to playing on easy words in that way. She walked up the path and rang the bell, and while she stood waiting, she could hear the television blaring. There she is. I think we can see from Mr. Wormwood, he's not going to be impressed. His TV time is being interrupted. The door opened by a small ratty man in a thin ratty moustache who was wearing a sports coat that had an orange and red stripe in the material. Yes, he said, peering at Miss Honey. If you're selling raffle tickets, I don't want any. I'm not, Miss Honey said. And please forgive me for butting in on you like this. I'm Matilda's teacher at school, and it's important I have a word with you and your wife. Got into trouble already, has she? Mr. Wormwood said, blocking the doorway. Well, she's your responsibility from now on. You're going to have to deal with her. She's no trouble at all, Miss Honey said. I've come with good news about her. Quite startling news, Mr. Wormwood. Do you think I might come in for a few minutes and talk to you about Matilda? We're right in the middle of one of our favourite programmes, Mr. Wormwood said. This is the most inconvenient. Why don't you come back some other time? Miss Honey began to lose patience. Mr. Wormwood, she said, if you think some rotten TV programme is more important than your daughter's future, then you ought not to be a parent. Why don't you switch the damn thing off and listen to me? That shook Mr. Wormwood. He was not used to being spoken to in that way. He peered carefully at the slim, frail woman who stood on his porch. Oh, very well then, he snapped. Come on in and let's get it over with. Miss Honey stepped inside. Mrs. Wormwood's not going to thank you for this, the man said, and he led her into the sitting room, where a large platinum blonde lady was gazing at the TV screen. There she is. I think he's right. Look at the expression on her face. Who is it? The woman said, not looking round. Some school teacher, Mr. Wormwood said. She said she's got to talk to us about Matilda. He crossed to the TV set and turned down the sound, but left a picture on the screen. Don't do that, Harry, Mrs. Wormwood cried out. Willard is just about to propose to Angelica. You can still watch it while we're talking, Mr. Wormwood said. This is Matilda's teacher. She says she's got some sort of news to give us. My name is Jennifer Honey, Miss Honey said. How do you do, Mrs. Wormwood? Miss Wormwood glared at her. What's the trouble then? Nobody invited Miss Honey to sit down, so she chose a chair and sat down anyway. This, she said, was your daughter's first day at school. We know that, Mrs. Wormwood said, ratty about missing her programme. Is that all you've come to tell us? Miss Honey stared hard at the other woman. She allowed the silence to hang in the air until Miss Wormwood became uncomfortable. Do you wish me to explain why I've come? She said. Get on with it then, Mrs. Wormwood said. I'm sure you know, Miss Honey said, that children in the bottom class at school are not expected to be able to read, write, spell, juggle with numbers when they first arrive. 5-year-olds just can't do that. But Matilda can do it all. And if I am to believe her, I wouldn't, Miss Wormwood said. She was still ratty about losing the sound on TV. Was she lying then, Miss Honey said. When she told me that nobody taught her to multiply or to read, did neither of you teach her? Teach her what? Mr. Wormwood said. To read books, Miss Honey said. Perhaps you did teach her, perhaps she was lying. Perhaps you have shelves of books all over the house, I wouldn't know. Perhaps you are both great readers. Of course we read, Mr. Wormwood said. Don't be so daft. I read the auto car and the motor from cover to cover every week. This child has already read an astonishing number of books, Miss Honey said. I was simply trying to find out if she came from a family that loved good literature. There we are. She's definitely not happy about missing her soap opera, is she? We don't hold a book reading, Mr. Wormwood said. You can't make a living from sitting on your fanny and reading storybooks. We don't keep 'em in the house. I see, Miss Honey said. Well, all I came to tell you was that Matilda has a brilliant mind, but I expect you already knew that. Of course I knew she could read, the mother said. She spends her life up in her bedroom, buried in some silly book. But does it not intrigue you, Miss Honey said, that a little girl of 5 is reading long adult novels by Dickens and Hemingway? Does that make you jump up and down with excitement? Not particularly, said the mother. I'm not in favour of blue stocking girls. A girl should think about making herself look attractive so that she can get herself a good husband later on. Looks are more important than books, Miss Hunky. The name's Honey, Miss Honey said. Now look at me, Miss Wormwood said. And then look at you. You chose books and I chose looks. Miss Honey looked at the plain, plump person with a smug suet pudding face who was sitting across the room. What did you say? She asked. I said you chose books and I chose looks, Miss Wormwood said. And who's finished off the better off? Me, of course. I was sitting pretty in this nice house with a successful businessman husband, and you're left slaving away teaching a lot of nasty little children their ABC. Quite right, Sugar Plum, Mr. Wormwood said, casting a look of such simpering sloppiness at his wife. It would make a cat feel sick. Miss Honey decided that she wasn't going to get anywhere with this couple, but she might try if she didn't lose her temper. I haven't told you all of it yet. Matilda, so far as I can gather at this early stage, is also a kind of mathematical genius. She can multiply complicated figures in her head like lightning. What's the point of that when you can buy a calculator? Mr. Wormwood said. A girl doesn't get a man by being brainy, Mrs. Wormwood said. Look at that film star, for instance. And she started pointing to the TV screen, where a bosomy female was being embraced by an actor in the moonlight. You don't think she got him to do that by multiplying figures at him, did you? Not likely. And now he's going to marry her. You see if he doesn't. And she's going to live in a mansion with a butler and lots of maids. Miss Honey could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had heard that parents like this existed all over the place and that their children turned out to be delinquents or dropouts, but it was still a shock to meet a pair of them in the flesh. Matilda's trouble, she said, trying once again, is that she is so far ahead of everyone else. It might be worth her thinking about some extra kind of private tuition. I seriously believe she could be brought up to university standard in 2 or 3 years of proper coaching. University? Mr. Wormwood shouted, bouncing up in his chair. Who wants to go to university, for heaven's sake? All they learn is bad habits. That is not true, Miss Honey said. If you had a heart attack this minute and had to call a doctor, that doctor would be a university graduate. If you got sued for selling someone a rotten second-hand car, then you'd get a lawyer, and he'd be a university graduate too. Do not despise clever people, Mr. Wormwood, but I can see we're not going to agree. I'm sorry I burst on you like this. And Miss Honey rose from her seat and walked out of the room. Mr. Wormwood followed her to the front door. Good of you to come, Miss Hawkes, or was it Miss Harris? It was neither, Miss Honey said, but let it go. And anyway, she went. I think Miss Honey now knows what kind of house that Matilda's living in, don't you? I'm sure your parents will be a little bit more positive than that about you. They definitely are when I speak to them on parents' evening.